And welcome to this second day of the biennial ETUC conference, what we call the big conference, which this year is entitled A Blueprint for Equality. And welcome also to this panel on the European Central Bank's policies and inequality. Before I say more on the topic and our panelists, I would like to reiterate some housekeeping rules. So the session is hybrid. For those of you joining us online, you may use the Q&A function to ask questions. There is also interpretation in French. Please be aware that the session is recorded for those of you who are here. And if you would like to tweet, we have a hashtag, which is for the number equality. So in these 3 days, we seek to collectively debate what actions should be taken to stem growing inequalities across different dimensions. We engage in this debate starting from the premise that inequality has not been a historic accident, but rather the product of a series of ideologically embedded and ultimately political choices about the way our economies and societies generate and allocate resources and opportunities. So in this panel, we turn our focus onto the European Central Bank, an EU institution, the constitutional setup of which, most notably its political independence and its primary mandate of maintaining price stability, has been a major political choice that the governments of EU member states made some time ago, and which has had profound consequences on the way that the Eurozone economies and societies have been generating and allocating resources and opportunities. Prior to the global financial crisis, the ECB policies, while they were successful in maintaining low and stable inflation, were also considered as having contributed to relatively meager output growth. Following the global financial crisis, the tasks and tools of the ECB expanded to include the maintenance of financial stability, the supervision of banks in the Eurozone, and the co-supervision, if not the main enforcement of economic adjustment programs linked to bailouts to troubled Eurozone member states. The ECB activities in these areas meant that it became harder to be oblivious of the distributional effects of its policies. In the context of its monetary policy strategy review, the ECB launched in 2020 a series of events and a portal which were called the ECB Listens, where citizens and civil society organizations expressed their concerns, expectations, and views on its monetary policy. Fighting poverty and inequality were actually stated by an important number of respondents as areas in which the ECB should take more action. Moreover, research by ECB staff has suggested that there are, at the country and individual level, higher income inequality or perception thereof are associated with lower public trust in the ECB, which is something that could impact the efficacy of its policies. Then in a speech last November, it was Isabel Schnabel, member of the Governing Council of the ECB, essentially argued that the ECB's policies, aiming at meeting its long undershot inflation target at 2%, reduced income inequality as they stimulated economic activity and benefited more those households and individuals at the lower end of the income distribution. On the other hand, she argued that the impact of the asset purchases that the ECB has been making in the previous decade and has been continuing till now, the impact of these purchases on wealth inequality, although less clear whether it was positive or negative, was likely more favorable for those households at the upper end of the wealth distribution, thereby exacerbating wealth inequality. So there were two different effects. Her policy conclusion was that the ECB should remain focused on its primary objective, maintaining price stability, and that any distributional effects that possibly increase wealth inequality should be taken into account when weighing up options of using alternative policy instruments. So what kind of assets to buy, for example. So what I would like to do today is to try to discuss and unpack these points, looking back in the previous decade, in the policies of the ECB in the previous decade, and also looking forward, because we have a new situation now. Inflation has been rising to levels not seen in Europe for decades. Are these the only channels through which the ECB's recent policies may have an impact on inequality, namely the income inequality and the wealth inequality? And have these channels, even these channels, if they are indeed active, have they been working as Isabel Schnabel has stated? Is there a case for integrating inequality considerations more centrally when deciding monetary policy actions, even under the current circumstances where inflation has surged? And if tackling inequality is a prerequisite for successfully pursuing the green transition objectives of the EU, and if climate change can impact inflation in different ways, how should the ECB use its tools and which tools to support these objectives? And what would greater consideration of inequality mean for the ECB's accountability and legitimacy? Last but not least, given that what we will discuss here today, are there any recommendations for trade unions to shape or adapt their strategies for supporting or indeed pressuring the ECB to take more action against inequalities? So, to discuss these questions, I am delighted to have here with me today one speaker, and waiting for one more. He's coming. Okay, we got him on the phone. So for now, I will present you Clément Fontin, Professor of European Economic Policies in the Université Catholique de Louvain and in University Saint-Louis in Brussels. His research has been focusing on, among other things, central banking, and in particular the ECB and the expansion of its roles during the Eurozone crisis. While he's also one of the authors of the Do Central Banks Serve the People, a book I have here, and which I highly recommend to anyone interested in the political economy of central banking. And we're also expecting Stan Jourdan, so I will present him to you once he's here. And I should say at this point that despite our efforts, it has regrettably not been possible to have a representative of the ECB with us here today. So, a first question that I would like to ask Clément is to give us some more detail on how the ECB expanded its tools during the period of the global financial and the Eurozone crisis, and why did the use of these new or recalibrated tools, which was using before but just changed the way it started using it was using them, why did they raise questions more prominently on whether the ECB policies have an impact on inequality?
So thank you very much, Sotiria, for the introduction. Thank you also for the organizer for the invitation. Just received a message from Stan. He's stuck in the mess around the European Council, so he's coming in 10 minutes. And all his apologies. Today we are going to talk about the distributional consequences of asset purchases, among others. So basically, in plain terms, who wins and who loses from the ECB monetary policy. So we're trying to zoom on that. So it's a very technical topic with a lot of obscure words. We are very lucky to be not so many in the room. Online, I don't know. At least in real flesh, you're not that many. You are actually less than my usual students class. So feel free to interrupt and ask any question about stuff that is unclear, because there will be a lot of unclear vocabulary. Unfortunately, and I'm not a central banker, so I do not have such a super technical knowledge as they do, but as I am sometimes able to translate them to normal people, so don't hesitate to ask any translation if needed. We are going to zoom to start with on the ECB asset purchases. So when the crisis started in 2007, 2009, the ECB was a bit slower than other central banks to dare to start to purchase assets on the financial market. So why do central banks started to purchase those assets? Well, with the subprime crisis, one of the most vicious effects was that you got a spiral, a downward spirals in prices. And this was putting basically all the financial system at threat, including as well sovereign states, because they needed to reimburse their debt. And with the prices of assets falling down, the prices of yields, of interest rates was going up. So there was really a challenge here for the ECB to intervene and to start to purchase a large amount of those assets, including sovereign bonds and mostly sovereign bonds, so the debt of states. And the ECB, by doing so, was also playing its role of lender of last resort or market maker of last resort. In other words, the institution that intervene to stabilize the Eurozone. Okay, so the Eurozone has no fiscal union, no, not so much at least. And so the markets are constantly trying to test its solidity. And in this case, it's very important that the central bank intervene and purchase assets in face of market speculation so that states do not pay too high interest rate when refinancing their debt. However, when doing so, these purchases do have distributional consequences. It's not neutral on the distribution of wealth and income in society. So we really have to think about the distribution and effects of asset purchase as a side effect from the willingness of the ECB to stabilize both the sovereign bond market and the financial markets at large. So we cannot say that the ECB wants to increase inequality by making rich richer directly. That would be wrong. They are not that vicious, if you want.
Yeah. Would you please explain why there is a distributional effect when the ECB buys these assets?
Yeah, exactly.
You said some people win and some people lose.
Exactly.
So who are these?
So we don't know.
we don't know their names and addresses, but
yes.
They are.
So there are two effects when the ECB purchases this asset. There is a direct effect that is very easy to observe, that is in the face of everyone. It's the fact that asset prices rise because you got much more demand. So it's an automatic effect on the market, so the price go up. And this is what they want to do, to push the prices of the asset up. So who becomes richer when the prices of assets go up? It's asset holders.
Those who own them.
Who are asset holders? Who is owning assets? I do not own assets. Most people, well, it's good to speak at a trade union conference rather than a banker conference, because when I ask this kind of question, it's much more likely that not so many people of you hold assets, actually. So I think that most of us in these rooms are losers of this direct effect of asset purchases. Okay, and more seriously, we know that those who own assets are, of course, located among the most privileged in society. Actually, to give you an order of ideas, the 10% in the UK, the 10% of the richest households hold around 80% of the financial assets. So, of course, the distribution of asset ownership is skewed towards the top end of the wealth distribution. So those people are, of course, the ones who are going to win first from these rising asset prices. However, the story, at least according to central banker, does not stop there, because there are supposedly indirect effects. What are these indirect effects? Well, the first obvious one is that not all the financial system go down. So the financial catastrophe is averted. And so this is also one indirect effect. If we would not have done anything, so the central banker says, actually the effects would have been worse. There would be an even larger financial crisis, and poor people suffer more than rich people in times of financial and economic crisis. So that's what they say. It's the first effect. The second effect is that it boosts growth. well, you purchase asset according to them, according to central banker, because the price of safe asset go up, financial institution will look to make money in other ways. So they will start to purchase riskier assets. What does it mean? They will start to lend to the real economy. And because banks and financial institutions will lend more to real economy, there will be more investment, and here comes the prophecy. There will be more investment, so there will be more employment, and because there will be more employment, it's equalitarian because the low-income households are the ones who rely the most on their wages in their wealth and, of course, income distribution. Okay, so all the question is, are the direct effect more important or are the indirect effect more important? If the direct effects are more important, then asset purchases are inequalitarian. If the indirect effects are more important, maybe some people get richer, but in total, actually, it's the employment effect that matters the most, so it's inequalitarian. So the consensus today among central banks is that they don't really know. They started their research on that topic very late in 2012. So 2 years after having starting to purchase this asset, they realized that like, oh, maybe we create winners and losers. Maybe it would be a good idea to study that. And well, the first study was a study by the Bank of England who say that, well, actually we are increasing inequalities, so maybe it's not such a good thing. Since then, central banks are starting to develop their models where they try to integrate this direct and indirect effect. But there are so many possible channels. Okay, so the distributive effect depends on the distribution of assets in the wide population, but also who owns a house. So for example, in Belgium, the monetary policy of the ECB is a bit less inequalitarian than in France. Why? Because there is much more house ownership in Belgium. So more people own a house, and so the prices of the house go up with the purchase of financial assets. So in Belgium, more people benefit from the fact that the prices of houses go up, even though not the people my age. Which is another dimension of inequality that we have to take into account. So now, consensus among central banks is that we don't know who is winning and we don't know who is losing. But the central, hello Stan, the European Central Bank is the only one to have a study which says actually inequalities go down. They are the only central bank in the world to have this study saying like, oh, actually we are decreasing inequalities by pushing the prices of assets up. So I have some issues with this study. Actually, it's the study of the ECB that infuriated me the most. So why? What do they show? In a few words, and I will not take more than 2 minutes. They say that, so they start in 2015, and they say that, well, since 2015, since we started to purchase a large amount of financial assets, if we look at the Gini index in Europe, inequality goes down, so it's thanks to us. Well, there are many issues here. First, Gini index is very poor at measuring wealth inequalities. So you've all heard about Gini index, I guess? No? So it's a kind of measure that is done to measure the inequalities. So people report, so it's polls that are made in the wide population, and people report how much wealth and income they have. Okay, it's kind of big poll that is conducted very often in societies. However, it's polls, so it's declarative, and there is no double check. Okay, so we know that this index is very bad at capturing the wealth and income of the richest people. Why? Because they will not say in a poll that they own a yacht that they are not supposed to own, right? So we use that. It's the most common used index to measure inequalities, but it's very bad at measuring the very top inequalities. And for example, Piketty and Saez, they really criticized a lot this index, but the ECB relies on it. And then it's also not very serious about how it measures the impact. So they just measure the wealth inequality impact, and they measure it in gross number. Okay, so what they do is that they divide the population in 5 groups, and they say that other groups who own the less wealth, so the one who have 1,000 euro in their bank account, they saw actually their wealth increase by 2%. Whereas the group that owns the most wealth, so the one who have more than 500,000 euro in their bank accounts, they saw their wealth go by 1%. And so because the poorest, so the 1,000 euro in the bank account went up by 2%, and the richest, so the one with 500,000 euro in the bank account went by 1%, then it decreases inequality. So if you do it in gross number instead of percentages, the one that are the poorest, they earn around 25 euros. And the one that are the richest, they earn around 10,000 euros. And so we did the calculation with the co-authors. At that rate, it would take more than 250 years for for the lowest, for the poorest household to actually reach the same kind of gains, not total amount of money in the bank account, but same number of gains that the one on the top. So we cannot really say that it's inequalitarian. At best, we can say we don't know. But there are a lot of doubts to think that it actually increases more inequality. Why? Just for one very simple reason: direct effects are easier to measure. There is a much more simple causality between the central bank purchases and the prices of financial assets. It's one direct effect. But the indirect effect, it goes through 4 or 5 kind of economic mechanism. It's much more diluted, much more uncertainty. And so even if we don't know, there is a good epistemic reason to believe, so in a principle of precaution, if you want, to say like, maybe we don't know, but it's still much more likely that it augments inequality.
Great, thank you. At this point, I will take the opportunity to welcome Stan Jourdan, our second speaker, who is the Executive Director of Positive Money Europe, a non-profit organization that was launched in Brussels in 2018, but has already grown into one of the leading campaign, if not the leading campaign, group scrutinizing the activities of the ECB and running campaigns and advocacy in the fields of monetary policy, European economic governance, and sustainable finance. And I've had the privilege of watching part of this growth and the great work as I am a member of their board of directors. So welcome, Stan. We just to update you, we've had yes, we've had a first take on what the ECB claims it's the impact of its policies on inequality has been. We mentioned the speech of Isabelle Schnabel, and Clément gave us an introduction of how these channels work. So at this point, I would like to ask both of you, well, apart from issues of measurement of inequality, do we also know whether these channels have actually worked like this in practice? So, for example, if asset purchases are supposed to stimulate economic activity, do we know that they actually did that, or whether they were just put into, they just bought financial assets without being channeled to the real economy? And do we know whether economic activity actually led to jobs good enough and well paid enough, stable enough, so that the income effect has taken place the way the ECB has been claiming? Stan, would you like to give us a first comment? I think that you don't need to press anything.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And sorry for being late. Yeah, there will be another story to tell you why. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me and for organizing this debate. Sorry, Clément, I missed, but I think I know very much what you said, because actually we wrote articles together on this topic, especially on the paper that the ECB wrote and that Clément just mentioned. But my take on this is basically, if you like, the defense line of the ECB is to say, okay, sorry, we might have increased wealth inequality, but never mind, because we created so many jobs that in effect it compensates each other. So that's really, I think, the state of the art bit in the central bank literature on this is this idea that there's a U-shaped curve. So okay, we might have increased wealth, but we created more jobs. I think so. Yeah, there are many counter arguments. Some have already been said, but for me, The first one is to say, well, okay, you created jobs, but isn't that because you created a recession in the first place? Especially in the case of the ECB, they precipitated the eurozone in an austerity mindset, basically in the early days of the eurozone crisis, because they didn't want to intervene on government bonds market. They the old Greece story. They made the crisis worse, which destroyed more jobs in the first place. And of course, finally in 2015, they eventually, Mario Draghi eventually did whatever it takes, quantitative easing, asset purchase, and eventually they stabilized the government bonds. But for 5, 6, 7 years, they effectively created an austerity mindset and basically they destroyed jobs. So that's first, let's not forget about that. Second, of course, the jobs that have been created, and I don't think I need to lecture people from trade union about that, but the jobs that have been created are not the same quality as before. There are more and more short-term contracts, interim contracts, all these things. I don't think I need to really explain, but it's obvious that the new jobs are more precarious. And therefore, the question becomes, okay, so maybe we have this employment effect, these gains on employment versus the wealth effect. Which effect is more long-lasting? I think we can have a debate on that. Some people would say, well, it's so much better to have jobs, but I think how fast can this job be destroyed again? That's a bit my point. Versus wealth effect, they can also be destroyed quite quickly if there's a crisis. But we know that the central bank will always intervene again to sustain asset prices because they are very afraid of financial instability. So I don't have I'm not saying I have a final conclusion on this. I think the jury is still out there. There are good arguments to say, well, it's much worse, that we have, the job creation is indeed much better. So then the argument becomes, okay, so for the sake of creating jobs, is it okay? Is it a side effect we need to accept that we also increase the wealth of the wealthier? And then in order to go in that road, then you need to consider, have we tried all the other options that could create more jobs and reduce inequality without increasing the wealth of the 1%, basically? And I think I don't think we can say that, no, we have not tried everything, that's clear. And I could tell you a bit more later, but our campaign, for example, has been focusing on helicopter money, which is a kind of weird name to say, let's give money to people. And we argue that the ECB could give money directly to the people, and that would be a typical way of stimulating the demand in the economy without necessarily. So yeah, there are alternatives. And maybe the final point for me is to say that in this debate we have focused a lot on what happens with quantitative easing, with low interest rates. And I think perhaps sometimes we lose sight of the basic way that finance is working. And in France we have this saying that on ne prête qu'aux riches. You only lend money to the rich people. And I think we have to. So the ECB works through banks, right? The transmission of monetary policy goes through the banking system. And banks, what do? They lend money if they make sure that they can get repaid at some point. So that means they look at the opportunity to lend to actors in the economy. Their main criteria will be the risk. How risky is it for them to potentially lose money? And then it's obvious that, well, someone who is already rich, someone who has collateral, someone who can pledge a house as collateral to a loan, or will get money from the bank, will get a loan at a cheaper rate than someone who is poor. And so in that way, basically what we see is that credit, debt, for the rich people, it's a leverage. It's a leverage to launch companies. It's a leverage to buy real estate assets, to buy assets in the economy. For the poor, debt is a burden. For the poor people, debt for low-income employees, it's actually debt over the last few decades has been replacing the lack of wage growth, actually, where people have to take consumer credit just to get by, So I think we have this. So anyway, I'm going even beyond because whatever the ECB is doing, they will always be working in the system where if the only channel through which they can work is bank loans, is creating credit in the economy, then this will always have an uneven effect in the population. And I think this is a point that is not really, well, actually there's one paper, lately the Bank of International Settlement in Basel has come up with a paper, and there's one sentence that hints to the fact that maybe maybe when the ECB stimulates the economy by lowering rates, maybe the problem is that only a certain people can actually reap the benefit of low interest rates. So we finally maybe starting to touch this problem, but I don't think it's an issue that many people are.
May I just take the opportunity here to open a parenthesis so that one of you explains what the term quantitative easing means, because I'm not sure it's clear to everyone. And also this channel through which the ECB, you mentioned, impacts the real economy through the banks. Could you have a bit more explanation on how exactly that works in very simple words so that we're all on the same page?
So quantitative easing is what Clément was calling, I think, asset purchase. So this is when the ECB purchases government bonds or corporate bonds as well, but mainly government bonds, so government debt.
Loans
from markets to member states. And so when they do that, it reduces the interest rates. So that's why between 2015 to until a year ago, basically, we were talking actually about negative interest rate on government bonds, on government debt. So we've been that was thanks to the ECB. And actually that links to the last point I wanted to mention is, I think, in a way, what we have come to the moment where actually a major transmission channel of what ECB is doing is through fiscal, is the fact that they can support governments now. And we need to have the debate on this. But
so basically it becomes cheaper to borrow for
Yes.
governments and for corporations, and that allows them to invest more, to undertake more investment projects. And
so to explain the way the way monetary policy by the ECB works is really by setting interest rates, and because banks somehow have to refinance themselves at the ECB, if the ECB decides to lower rates, banks will effectively also lower rates on bank loans.
so the price of money, effectively.
It's basically, exactly, it's the price of money. The ECB is in charge of setting the price of money, and I think one issue we maybe we will come back to later is the problem that in a way they set the price of money across the board, so in a very blunt manner. So the price of money is supposed to be the same for everyone, but as I said, not everyone has the luxury to be able to borrow. But so basically, maybe later I would make the case that we need to have several different interest rates actually, in order to make sure money doesn't flow towards areas where that are not particularly useful for society.
Okay, thank you. So far, you have mentioned income and wealth inequality. Are there any other types of inequality that the policies of the ECB we could consider as having been created or exacerbated?
Yeah.
Clément?
So if the main direct inequality and effect is the fact that asset prices rise, again, who owns financial assets? Rich people. Who are rich people? Male. So there is gender inequality to start with. Actually, there have been studies that shows that so the ownership of financial assets is skewed toward rich people, and among rich people, there are more men that own financial assets than women. Because it's the kind of job that is related to payments in terms of financial assets, so in finance, in banking, and so forth and so on, it's more occupied by male than female. So there is a gender inequality. Then there is also intergenerational inequality. And so I was referring to that before, but one of the main channels of this direct effect is also through, when we talk about rising asset prices, one of the main common assets that is held among the population is a house ownership. So with owning houses, I don't. Maybe 30 years ago, I would have, but I don't, because the prices of housing, of course, have risen by 200% in average since 20 years in the euro area. And one of the main, pusher for that has been monetary policy. Why? Because when you have more liquidity and when banks and financial institutions are encouraged to lend more to the real economy, it means actually they are encouraging banks to grant more loans for houses because the rate is down as well. Okay, when you can borrow for 0.5%, you will have more tendency, even if you already own a house, to do a second loan to buy a second house somewhere, all right? And so this creates intergenerational equality. And moreover, of course, the older you are, the more financial assets you own. And so, of course, boom, it goes again. So yeah, you have these two dimensions.
So it's this, I mean, we often see headlines in the, at least I see it in the British newspapers that I read, that younger generations have more and more difficulty setting their foot in the house ownership ladder, as it's called, because it's very difficult to buy their first house so that then they can, at a later stage, possibly, you know, sell that to borrow, to buy a better one once they have a family and so on and so forth. So just to bring to take a step back, so we have been looking into whether the ECB policies have had an impact on inequality, because ultimately we want to ask whether inequality should and could become gain more center stage in the considerations of the ECB when it decides its monetary policy. So I would like also to turn the question on its head and ask you whether, in fact, inequality can also have an impact on the efficacy of monetary policy. Are there any effects there? So could we also make an argument for why central banks and the ECB in particular should care more about inequality, not just because you know, normatively is an important issue, but also because it also affects how well they can do the job they have set out to do.
Yeah, no, I think certainly so. I think that's and I think that's what makes me optimistic that central bank will eventually understand this, because there's a study, actually, the study from the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, that they just came up with a paper called Inequality Hysteresis. And the main argument, I mean, it's a long book, it's actually 120 pages, but main chapter is about the fact that indeed the problem is not only the problem that the ECB might exacerbate inequality, but actually inequality in itself is a problem for the conduct of monetary policy, just what you said. So, and the argument is that basically, if people, if you have an unequal society, and if your main channel is going to be increasing asset prices, well, okay, you're going to make the rich richer, but the rich are not really spending the money. So, you know, in economy, there's a concept of marginal propensity to consume. This is the percentage of, if I give you 1,000 euros and you 1,000 euros, how much of your 1,000 euros are you going to directly consume and therefore inject back in the economy? And of course, I mean, it's not rocket science. If you're on the low income side, you would spend most of the extra income that you get, versus if you're rich, you will maybe buy another yacht or something, but that's still a very small size, a small share of your wealth. So basically, and it's very standard Keynesian economics, but basically, if you want to stimulate the economy, you should target money injection towards the poor people, so they will spend more. So that's one thing. The second thing is what I also linking to what I said before about who is accessing credit, who can go to the bank and get a loan, because that's really how monetary policy works. There's the effect of lower interest rate on bank loans, and then also the effect on government bonds, as we said, and the government debt, the fact that it can also reduce the burden of public debt, and therefore at least avoid that politicians go into an austerity budget policy. But if we stick to the bank issue, the who gets credit, who goes to the bank to get a loan. I mean, obviously, if you're in a very low income situation, if you don't have a stable job, you're not going to go to the bank to buy a house and everything. So effectively, if a lot of people are what economists call credit constraints, that means they can't really, even if they wanted to, they could not really get a bank loan to invest or to do anything. Well, that means then a large part of the transmission channel for DCB just simply doesn't work. And so that's an issue for them. But I'm sure Clément has more to say.
Well, yeah, well, what Stan just said is completely right. And you have two more structural long-term effects to think about as well. The first one is that since the 80s around, so there is more inequalities in all Western industrial society, in Europe as well. And why? Because also the state is shrinking down. Okay, so the welfare state is shrinking down. There is less a pension system go less through the state, more with the capital markets. People need to rely more on private credit rather than on free schools or whatsoever. So finance is more important because of inequalities, okay? Because of the fact that the welfare state is shrinking down and there are more poor people that cannot access the usual welfare program, then they use financialized welfare program. They use this kind of predatory loans to try to survive. But this is also a source of financial instability. This is your subprime crisis, okay? The subprime crisis was loans provided to rather poor households so that they could access house ownership. But back in the days, they would have done that with governmental programs. But because governmental programs were shrinking down, and because there was inequality, there was still a way, governments still needed to find a way to help these people. So they tried to help them with private finance. So inequalities create more private predatory finance, which in turn create more financial instability. So this impacts central banks, okay? Inequality created subprime, which created a financial crisis, which impacted central banks. So this is the first long-term structural channel. The second structural channel, and this is really relevant in this conference, is the fact that since the 80s, well, the power of trade union decreased. I think we can say that. Yeah, okay, you agree with me, great. But so it means that bargaining power of labor decreased as well. And so in 2015, central bankers realized that somehow. Why? Because there was a problem of growth. So they tried to kickstart growth as much as they can. So they pushed a lot of liquidities. They did a lot of things, but they were like, okay, we put all that money in the financial system and still the economy doesn't restart. And so they realized that actually their own policies of, well, trying to crush trade unions as much as they can for 20 years, well, it impact their own objectives now, because they crush labor power so much, or they participated in crushing labor power so much that out of a recession, they could not have the growth they wanted, and they could not reach their own 2% inflation target, and they did not understand why inflation was not kicking up anymore. And this was, they realized, because trade union lost some power, and so because of that, the bargaining power of labor was low, and so wages did not go up. And central bankers in 2015, they actually wanted wages to go up so they would have a bit of inflation. So this kind of inequality, so the weakening power of labor bargain, also impacts central bank objective to the extent that when they want to kickstart growth, they do not have their usual channels of transmission of wages and labor. And on that point, and which is quite interesting as well, especially in this time, so in the 80s, the Bundesbank, so the German central bank, the example of conservative central bankers, if you want, the Bundesbank, they were negotiating with IG Metall and other trade unions a lot, right? And so they were using also this negotiation to kickstart growth when they needed to be. So the Bundesbank was a corporatist institution which needed trade union to conduct their policy. But when they created the EU, the ECB was not really helpful with the European Union trade initiative all the time. And well, they did not manage to have their IG Metall, and now they're suffering from that, from not having a EU IG Metall, if you want. I don't know, you choose.
Is it possible to make some pressure? That's the question. Is it possible to make some pressure?
Yeah, there is a mic.
Are you happy with having
Yeah.
some interventions from the floor?
I'm not the chair.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be a little bit mindful of time because I have a lot of questions to ask.
And I talk a lot.
So what? It's
You know.
okay? Yeah?
With the mic.
With the mic, yes.
With a microphone. Donc, I don't speak English very well, better French. I don't know.
There is
Yeah, you can speak French.
there is
Okay.
We all understand.
Merci.
The three of us.
J'essaie de m'expliquer. Donc, je pense que la question qu'on se pose ici, c'est effectivement si une politique totalement monétaire peut effectivement avoir des effets dans l'économie réelle. Okay? Donc, c'est une postation que on a choisi à niveau politique en Europe. Et, à mon avis, c'est à nous de décider si on veut continuer comme ça ou pas. Ma question se pose... Ok, pardon. Se pose sur un indice particulier. Donc, vous savez que la Banque centrale européenne a pour objectif la stabilité des prix, c'est-à-dire a comme objectif de combattre l'inflation, et except that, et là on faut souligner, elle a d'autres objectifs. Mais le problème de la Ecb, c'est justement de stabiliser les prix, point à la ligne. Pour faire ça, on a beaucoup d'indices techniques, comme disait justement le professeur. Un de ces indices, je pense que, justement comme il est nommé, c'est très indicatif de ce que fait la Banque centrale européenne. Je trouve... Alors, cet indice, il s'appelle... oh, je ne trouve pas. Attends, un moment, s'il vous plaît.
Vous voulez trouver ce que vous voulez
Non,
dire,
non, mais
et vous gardez- ok.
je ne trouve pas la plage. Bon, son acronyme, c'est le NAWRU.
Nero.
Nero, exactement. Cet indice, c'est un indice technique qui va fixer les niveaux de salaire pour obtenir l'inflation les prix. Mais je parle seulement, je ne suis pas en technique, mais je pense que c'est assez particulier qu'on utilise un indice technique qui tient sous contrôle les niveaux de salaire. Et à mon avis, le niveau de salaire, c'est le principal instrument de redistribution de la richesse dans un pays. Hein, parce que je ne comprends pas pourquoi moi, je me dois endetter pour avoir une maison. Et je pourrais bien avoir un salaire digne et plutôt haut pour permettre d'acheter tranquillement une maison ou n'importe quel bien, une auto, plutôt que manger, etc. Okay? Je pense que ça, c'est très important. Donc, je voulais votre opinion au sujet de ça, si vous voulez. C'est-à-dire que il me semble vraiment un peu incroyable, si vous voulez, qu'une banque centrale se pose des objectifs similaires, c'est-à-dire de tenir sous contrôle le niveau de salaire pour tenir sous contrôle l'inflation. Donc ça, au-delà de la question technique, mais c'est en perspective, à mon avis, très très clair de ce que c'est la Banque centrale européenne à ce moment. C'est-à-dire qu'il a une inversion logique, si vous voulez, et je termine, c'est-à-dire ma préoccupation, ce sont les prix, et normalement, comme justement on vient de dire, la question des prix avantage les personnes plus riches, bien évidemment, hein, et d'un point de vue réel, je dis, hein, et tient sous contrôle le salaire. Voilà, plutôt que je finis.
Merci. If you could take 1 minute each to answer this, or else we can also keep it for the Q&A part so that we move on. Would that be okay with you? That
Yep.
this is already one question we have at hand for the
On va répondre à votre question dans le reste de la conversation parce que c'est des thèmes qu'on va aborder dans tous les cas.
So I would like now to move on, because so far we have been looking back into the policies of the ECB during the decade of the 2010s and what impact it has had on inequalities, how inequality has been impacting the efficacy of the ECB's policies. So I would like to take us a bit forward to the present. And to state the discussion on whether the ECB should be more mindful, the ECB's policy should be more mindful or more active against inequalities, began during a period where inflation was persistently lower than its target. So the problem of the ECB was not that it had too high inflation to tame, but rather that inflation was so low and it could not get it to the target, as Clément said. This is why it was resorting to extraordinary measures to try to stimulate economic activity further so as to lift it to the 2%. Can we say that paying more attention, or any attention, to inequality would still make sense under the current circumstances, when inflation rates beat forecast after forecast of the European Commission, of the ECB? Every time we have new figures, it always ends up being higher than what they had told us the previous month, the previous quarter. And that given the fact that the primary objective, as you also said, of the European Central Bank is price stability. This is what is keeping prices, inflation low and stable at 2%. Could trying too hard to tackle inequality distract from tackling inflation, which is a big problem right now and which also has very unequal effects? Because as we have seen, especially the kind of inflation in general is regressive, but even the sources of inflation we see now, energy, food prices, hurt the households with lower incomes the most. And could trying to pay more attention to inequality ultimately damage the reputation of the ECB and therefore its capacity to maintain stable inflation? And please try to be a bit more concise in your answer so that we can go through as many of the questions we have in mind as possible.
Yes. So yes, inflation right now is impacting the poor more than the rich. That's super clear, because energy and food spending are basically constrained spending. People don't really have a choice to spend less if they want to on these two spending items. People need to eat, and they need to eat their homes when it's winter. First point. So now the question is, what should the ECB do in reaction to this? The ECB has announced that they will start raising rates because they see, oh, we have inflation, so okay, back to the old textbooks. When we see inflation, we raise interest rates. And the problem is and the ECB even admits this publicly. So they say, we know this is not going to, raising rates will not reduce energy price, because energy price come from basically out of the EU. Basically, we import gas and oil, and it's the international market that set those prices, not the ECB. So clearly we don't see how this works, and then raising rates will have no impact on consumer behavior. As I said, people will still buy food because they have to. So it's not like you will change the supply and demand through interest rates in a way that would reduce inflation. So the only reason why the ECB is doing this, well, that's actually maybe two. Maybe one thing is which is a kind of non-explicit reason, but maybe they are trying to depreciate the euro against the dollar, because that would actually make that would make the price of gas and oil cheaper if the euro was stronger. And the euro has hit a 5 record low level right now. So maybe they want to do this, but they're not saying this because they could not. Actually, it's not really the mandate. And the other reason is they just feel pre-pressured from all these institutions, all the other central banks. The US is raising the rate because the US situation is different. Maybe there's more reasons in the US to raise interest rate. I just feel like they are being pressured to do something because they have a price stability mandate. The only thing they're supposed to do is to act on inflation. Right now, they could do nothing, in my opinion, about inflation, but still, I mean, they could do something, but not in this way. So they feel, but they still feel pressure to do something, and the only thing they know to do is to raise interest rate. So I don't think that's a good solution. What is it going to do is it's going to make it's going to potentially create a recession. So this will destroy jobs again, and then that will make the recovery even more difficult afterwards. Typical of the Eurozone, we always intervene too late, and then we have a longer recession and other areas. I'm not sure I was spot on your question, but I think I needed to
explain. It's more an answer
that.
to my next question, but I'll go to Clément to
Okay.
see what he has to say, and we'll come back to that. And I would just like to say that this, in fact, provides an answer to your question, because this is how the ECB tries to tame inflation, by choking off demand, which increases unemployment, and therefore makes wage claims lower, because people, there are not enough jobs to go around. Clément?
But this is also the opportunity to answer the question that was asked by my former students, José. Hello, José. Yeah, still very focused. I'm joking. So we just need to go back. So why did trade union lose power, and how did central bank react to inflation? Actually, these two questions, they have the same answer, and we have to go back a bit quickly to the end of the 70s. So there was a lot of inflation, and the Federal Reserve back in the days, they were like, we're going to crush all of that. Okay, so they put the interest rate up to 10%. So what did happen? All the economic collapse, trade union in the States, it weakened them even a bit more. And so actually the independence of central bank and the fact that they were focusing on inflation and that they rose interest rates so much, it really destroyed the post-World War Keynesian system that existed in the United States back in the days. And this is how central banks used to typically react against inflation. We crush the economy, we crush labor power so that we don't see wages rise anymore, and so we can control inflation. And now there is a risk that the scenario will be played again. There is only a risk though, because hopefully they did learn a bit. And at least in the Eurozone, no one at the ECB say that wages are an issue for now. And this is a change. Like if we were in 2012 or in 2010, the ECB would already say, oh, there is risk that wages will rise in the future. And so they are not saying that anymore now. So this is a glimpse of hope that their view on inflation is more complex, and they know that raising rates to up to 10% won't help, because it will only crush the economy and we might have even more stagflation. So there is some learning effect, and maybe they are thinking 2 times about the kind of tools and the kind of policy answer they have, because they know that crushing all the economy is not so much an answer neither.
So would you expect that using then the more traditional tools for taming the current inflation surge, so raising interest rates, would on balance, so looking into different impacts, have a benign or a malign effect on income inequality? Because, as I said, we know that inflation tends to have strongest negative effects on the lower income households. At the same time, if the ECB hikes the interest rates and we have a recession in addition to inflation, which also tends to create a recession in the economy, because if households have, they can buy fewer goods, demand goes down. If the uncertainty that inflation creates also crashes investment. So would you think that under the current circumstances, the positive impact on households' budget of reducing inflation would be stronger than, would be more benign than the malign impact of possibly causing a recession in the Eurozone economy, which would lead to job losses, which we know that typically affect those at the more precarious position in the labor market the most? And if so, would there be any alternative tools to think about for trying to manage this inflation? Because we do get from central banker statements, we do get the impression that the ECB is also concerned about maintaining its reputation of delivering price stability. We see, for example, that more for the Fed, but it might not be long before we have this discussion here as well. We hear that the Fed has been behind the curve. It did not act fast enough. So is it possible? What do you think about that?
I will talk first about the channels, and then Stan will talk about the alternatives. So about the channels, I think that central bankers, at least at the ECB, not national central bankers from Germany, among others, but the central bankers at the ECB, they know that with monetary policy, you can be good at crashing the economy. So you can put 10% interest rate and the economy crash, and then there is less inflation. But that this is not a solution. They know that, because killing growth, and this would also damage their reputation. On the other hand, they know that raising interest rate don't really help to counter this kind of inflation, as Stan just said. So I think that their only answer, as you said, is reputational. And this is a paradox. We really have to understand that the main reason why central banks are independent today, and so that we don't have democratic control over them, it was that because we were afraid that politicians would put pressure on central banks. So central banks always respond by putting more money in the economy, so to help them getting re-elected and blah, blah, blah. So this was the main reason why central banks became independent. So what are we seeing today? It's not that political authority put pressure for central bank to put more liquidity. Actually, today, political authority put more pressure on central banks so that they react against inflation. And central banks tell them, but we don't have the tools to react to this kind of inflation. We cannot really do that. But against the assumption for which we have independent central banks, what elected authority do today is completely the opposite of what they were supposed to do in the theoretical models. They are not pressuring central banks to put money all over. They're pressuring central bank to put interest rate up, even though central bankers know that this won't help, which is kind of crazy. And so this is also why we have to consider the responsibility of all the economic players. For once that technocrats are a bit reasonable, it's elected authorities that push them not to be reasonable right now. So this is an issue, and hopefully there are alternatives to that.
Stan, would there be any alternative tools to just hiking interest rates for taming inflation or not making it worse, while not killing the economy?
Yes, I think so. I think in a way, raising interest rate as such is not perhaps the issue. I mean, right now the ECB will raise interest rate by 0.25 basis points. This is really nothing. The problem is the overreaction that this triggers and the fear that this creates. So especially now in sovereign bond markets, as I mentioned, Italy, the what we call the spreads, so the difference between the cost of borrowing for the German government versus the Italian government or the Greek government has increased, and that's really bad because it's unfair first. It's an overreaction for markets, and because you basically create a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby if I'm an investor and I suspect that some other investors think that Italy will go bust, therefore I also think Italy will go bust, and therefore you make Italy go bust because everyone thinks like that. So this is really the market folly.
So it makes it more difficult for Italian, Greek, other troubled governments to borrow to finance their projects.
Yeah, and then first you create a Eurozone debt crisis again. This is the last thing we want. We have a war at the doorstep of the EU. So the worst thing we want is EU countries fighting against each other on this. And making government funding more expensive because of that, which makes it harder for the government to do energy compensation checks, to do to make transfers to compensate for the inflation. I think actually, so that's my response, right? I think the first line of response for this type of inflation now is not monetary policy, it's fiscal policy. And so that's why it's really key that the ECB does not let a new Eurozone crisis happen, because this will trigger more austerity again. So they need to come up with a way to basically control the spreads between countries, to make sure that countries don't, as I said, don't go back to austerity. For me, that's really the main thing. Now, if we want to solve so in a way, I'm saying on the short term, I don't see how we can tackle inflation. So let's not even try, if you like. Now, if we want on the long run, because I think what we see now, the energy prices going up, what we see, it's a repeat scenario of what will happen if we do a carbon price, carbon tax, or if we are serious about the climate change, we need to make everything that relies on fossil fuel more expensive. And so in a way, I almost wish that the inflation on energy price will not, from a climate viewpoint, I think
Would not fall.
We don't want energy price to go down after this current period. Food prices, yes, but not. Of course, the problem is they rely on each other. For food, you need energy. But anyway, so I'm saying this to say then on the long run, what's happening now is really a call for really addressing the transition, the energy transitions more seriously. And if I think on this, the ECB can do something on the medium to long term. At Positive Money Europe, we have a campaign called Unlock Renovation. And what we call is really for massive investment in the energy transition, in renewables, but also home energy efficiency. There's lots of jobs as well to create on this. And what the ECB could do on this is actually create, as I hinted before, to have a system where we have two different interest rates, basically. There's a normal interest rate. And as I said, I'm not traumatized if it raises by 0 point something points. But on top of that, in addition to that, they should have a zero interest rate that remains at 0 or even lower to 0 for that banks can use if they fund green projects. So basically, you make the money cheaper for green project, for energy transition. And I think this is in the power of the ECB. They could decide to do this, and that would basically help multiply the scale of the investment in renewables and so on, which would, on the long run, I know it's not going to happen immediately, but on the medium to long run, that would eventually, reduce the price of energy, because we will have green energy that does not rely on oil and gas, and therefore are not volatile, are domestically produced. So this creates jobs internally, and that would help reduce the trade deficit that we have, and that are greener.
So effectively, you're saying that the ECB should create different interest rates for financing policies, which would allow us to deal with any inflation effects that are related to climate change, and policies that are meant to tackle it, which in fact answers my next question, because I was going to ask you about this speech that Isabel Schnabel delivered more recently about the three different types, 3 different ways in which climate change can impact on inflation. And all of these type of inflation are likely to be particularly detrimental, again, for the households at the lower end of the income distribution. So starting again from the premise that in order to tackle climate change, we need to tackle inequalities, what the ECB should be doing. Okay, to move on, addressing inequalities can be a secondary objective of the ECB, as is full employment, supporting the EU in meeting its green transition objectives. And while there could be synergies in pursuing these different secondary objectives beyond price stability, there are also likely to be trade-offs. So do you think that the ECB has the legitimacy to choose which of these objectives to prioritize over others? And if not, what do you think should be done?
Yeah, so I think everyone knows, probably in this room, the ECB has the main objective, price stability, as Mr. said, but then they have these so-called secondary objectives. And I think I've been working I've been following central banking for 10 years, maybe more for you, Clément, but And for the last 10 years, we had this debate every time, like, oh, we have the secondary mandate, why the ECB is not using this, and so on. I think basically my analysis of this is the problem for the ECB is that the way the treaty is written is too vague. There are just too many possibilities, possible ways of interpreting what the secondary mandate should or could be. And while it's clear that I don't think currently there are any much trade-offs actually between inequality and price stability. But the problem is the legitimation. So the ECB, every time I speak to central bankers, they tell me, oh, but it's not for us to interpret. It's so vague. If we decide that we should focus on climate change, was a debate 2 years ago. Then why don't we also? Doesn't that mean we kill jobs in Germany because we are going to get shut down? We're going to kill the car manufacturing industry. So I think the ECB just doesn't want to choose what objective they should fulfill. That's why our proposal at Posimony Europe is to say, well, then okay, let's get politicians to choose. And I think we need a dialogue in the European Parliament, as constant dialogue with the European Central Bank. And so I think every year the European Parliament adopts a report on the ECB. They have a resolution. They might as well say in this resolution what they think should be the prioritization of the secondary objectives. I think at least the ECB would have little excuse not to act on this. So I think that in theory we could walk in that direction, and I think we're working on it. So I think it will happen someday, but it's long, very long. And for me, my experience as my job is to basically lobby the European Parliament and the ECB on these issues. And my experience is that we can shortcut that because it might be too long to wait until we get a solution on the secondary mandate. We can shortcut it by actually really pushing harder on the point that it's actually not a secondary mandate. Because if you say to the central bank, oh, it's a secondary mandate, it sounds like, oh yeah, it's a first class, as we say, a first class issue, like it's a luxury issue if you can. Because what they say now is we have so much trouble ending inflation. So why don't you want us to also look at those other issues where we're not doing our job on the primary mandate? So every time we can push an issue, framing it as a primary mandate issue, we can do that because there is academic evidence now that says inequality is making monetary policy harder to achieve. So I think we can really push harder on this point because then they have really little excuse not to think about it. So that would be my response. But
No. I think in an ideal world, we need to take the Maastricht Treaty and put it in a bin and write a treaty that is adapted to 2022 and not to the fantasies of that generation at the end of the 80s. However, we're not in an ideal world, right? So what can we do? We can do, I think that Stan at some point, and he's talking as a powerful activist, and is right to say so, that we should try to push everything under the price stability primary objective, because this is really what central banks are reactive to, and something that Stan doesn't say, that it's also much easier to legitimize in front of the Court of Justice when the crazy German or other liberals will bring you down there. Okay, because every time that the central bank does something, it ends up in front of the constitutional court in Germany, because German people or German elites, some kind of German elites, try to push back the ECB to a much more narrow traditional role. So ideally, we want a new treaty. We won't have a new treaty because we are not living in an ideal world. We want central banks to really act on that, so we can say that, oh, it's in your primary mandate, so do something about it. However, I also do think that central banks don't have the legitimacy to pick up winners and losers. They don't have the legitimacy to choose which industry will survive or not. So we should at the same time try to find new channel of coordination within the existing treaty. And so this can be done in front of the European Parliament. And I also like another idea that is floating around, which is a kind of European Credit Council, where we would have a lot of partners around the table, hopefully trade unions as well. And these partners would decide which are the prioritized sectors in which should be helped and fostered by investment. And maybe the ECB could use that to redirect its monetary policy towards more desirable investment, or could use the taxonomy if the taxonomy is a bit serious about something as well. So anyway, we need the money of the ECB to go towards stuff that we really need. And we also need the ECB not choosing alone on this because it does not have the legitimacy to do so. So we need to be serious about new form of channels of coordination and on policy proposals such as the taxonomy.
Okay, thank you very much. At this point, I would like to open the floor, the online floor and the actual floor here for some questions. Please be concise because we don't have that much time, and I would still also like to ask a couple of concluding questions for Jackie for the briefing session afterwards. So Kalina first and then Nicola, and then okay, so we have 5 questions.
So you won't have time.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
So my question is brief because this is really not my area. So I really appreciate also explanations. It was to me very clear and very interesting. One of the things I was wondering about when you were talking in the beginning about this strategy, which effectively makes the rich richer directly in the sort of argument as well, you know, and indirectly it also makes other people better off. Does anyone talk about the environmental externalities of this strategy? Because you mentioned, oh, then the rich can get their, you know, whatever third yacht, or they can get their 5th car or their private jet or something like this. And obviously, you know, all of this sort of making the rich richer has been shown to have environmental effects. So the question is, do people talk about this?
Nicola?
Very interesting panel. I heard about impacts, I heard about trade-offs, but I was being facetious here, but I was a bit confused about the question of democratic accountability because I heard 2 very interesting stories. One, we just happen to have great technocrats at the moment. Let's not have politicians interfering with them. 2, let's ask the politicians to lobby and interfere with the European Central Bank to have different interest rates for different types of investment, to have a change of. So which one is which? And can you elaborate a bit more on democratic accountability?
Hi, thanks. Henry Haapanala, University of Antwerp. I'm a PhD student in social and economic sciences. Maybe briefly on kind of the origins of the inflation spike which we are living in currently. I mean, you mentioned, I quite liked your point on kind of like the way in which the quantitative easing has not been able to filter the increasing amount of money down to wage earners, and that way increasing inflation. But then when we now talk about the inflation we're living in now, it wasn't the war in Ukraine that started this spike of inflation, but to a large extent, like the increase in fuel prices, you know, peak oil, all those kinds of aspects. We need to get rid of fossil fuels, all that kind of stuff. So it's not only the war in Ukraine that kind of started the inflation we're living in currently, but it was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But maybe your thoughts on kind of the underlying driving forces, and maybe again how that reflects the ECB undershooting the target, and now we are in the state we are currently.
Thank you. Please be concise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, citizens. Angelos Harlaftis, Epafos Advisors. We represent the EcoWaves movement, as you know, a pan-European Mediterranean regional movement, which is based in direct democracy in science and in ecology. Of course, we are speaking from 2000. I don't say 2008 for the eternal crisis. In the economic fields, we don't have crisis in such long periods. Crises are of 1 year, 1 year and a half, something like this, according to the theories. So the system has collapsed. Some years ago, 6 years ago, I made the question to a gathering of the banks, of European banks and the Central Bank of Europe, why do they continue, they enter to the quantitative easing? You described it in a more technical way. I'll tell it to the public simply. They are cutting money without any assets on the back. They can cut whatever money they want. That causes inflation. This is for sure, you know it is. Except if I don't know well the economic theories. So inflation is one of the main problems of the inflation is the quantitative easing. How much is the debt right now? How many trillions? I'm not speaking only for the European debt. I'm speaking also for the American debt because our economy is dependent from the Americans. So if they are going to collapse, we are going to collapse also. And you are speaking for assets, financial assets. What are these? The papers, the assets, the homes, and what you say. This is a technical thing they are doing in order to gather the real assets in their hands. And when we are going to collapse, to have all the real assets. Putin is speaking very well. I'm not with Putin. I'm against Putin and his undemocratic regime. But at his speech, he spoke on the point. And he has prepared with China the Euro-ASEAN policies, and they gathered the gold. We don't do anything with the gold asset. And this is very important. We don't have any kind of such asset. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We also have one question from an online attendant. What type of global level agreements are needed to support or at least remove obstacles in front of central banks to steer the financial stability if very much needed taxations were to be implemented?
Well, easy to answer to the last one. We need bank regulation, and we need regulation of the shadow banking system, of large asset manager, and blah, blah, blah. So again, we have to remember that monetary stability cannot be, monetary policy cannot be the answer for everything. We need also to talk about regulation, about fiscal policy, and not obsess so much about central bank. And so two points, very quick. About the causes of inflation, no, it's not quantitative easing, unfortunately. I mean, this is because the trade unions have less power. Quantitative easing did not translate into inflation, even though it's what actually central banks wanted to do a bit. Because what is inflation? Inflation, it's consumer prices. So if you want quantitative easing to have an impact on your consumer prices, you need to have, people who are real people who are richer. And it did not happen between 2015 and 2020. So indeed, it creates an inflation in asset prices. But an inflation in asset prices is not an inflation in consumer prices as it is measured right now. And about I love your question about democracy. So even if some of our technocrats are a bit more right and reasonable about causes of inflation now, it's a conjunctural effect, and we cannot trust them. We cannot trust that on a long-term basis. Okay, and we don't want to let them alone in front of this distributive question because they are too independent for that. And so I think that right now we're quite lucky with Isabelle Schnabel or Frank Elderson, but 10 years ago, we were a bit less lucky with Jean-Claude Trichet and other Jürgen Stark and other people like that. So we want them not to take this decision alone, and we have to trust democracy, and it's an iterative process. So I think that the more people will be involved in this kind of decision, the more responsibility will build up. And if you don't involve anyone in this kind of decision, responsibilities will never build up. So you need to trust the process a bit at the start, even though it's not super optimal at the start, so that its legitimacy and responsibility of players involved in increase in the middle and long term. That would be my answer. It's a bit of a hopeful answer, but come on, sometimes you need to be
Stan?
Yeah, so as for me, maybe, so just briefly on Karina's question, I think the point is obvious, but I've not seen any paper, at least by central banks, that are talking about this. But yeah, I think that's a strong point that we need more research on. I wanted to pick up on the question earlier as well about indicators. Central banks use technocratic indicators. The inflation indicator is one, the HICP. And actually, I would like to tell you an interesting story because I don't think many people know that. But in France, in the 70s, the CGT, the main trade union, they were developing their own inflation indicator because they realized that, of course, the basket of consumption of the working class is not the same as the average population. Therefore, they developed their own indicator based on what workers spend most as opposed to the average citizens. And I think that's interesting. I don't know why they stopped that. I think there's a whole book on it, which I haven't read. But yeah, I think it's interesting, maybe thought for you to think about this, because yes, the technocracy is very powerful, and a pattern in central banking in particular is they obfuscate what is political into technical indicators, these kind of things, and we really need to be as society, as civil society organization together with trading. I think we should be a bit stronger in questioning and challenging those way of technocratizing the politics. And also on the question, I think Nicola is your name. So my view, I don't know. It's very, the world is complex and there are ambiguities and it's not all black and white. But personally, in my experience, I've seen that the ECB internally in Frankfurt, the institution has transformed a lot. It has become a lot more progressive.
Thanks to people like Stan a bit as well.
No, but also there's a change in generation. The people who were in the first cohort of employees at ECB were quite old, probably because they were the guys who have been building the euro for the, it started in the 80s, the conversation about building the euro. So there's been a whole bunch of technocrats who were involved in this, and then they were the first guard when the ECB was created. And now there's been a renewal with younger people taking over because the old guys are retiring and so on. And also the Eurozone crisis has transformed the institution, where because the ECB had to step up and think beyond the national interest, think for the general interest of the European currency area. We can have a debate on this, but I actually do think the ECB can be an ally on some progressive causes. The ECB is explicitly in favor of more redistribution across the union. They're explicitly in favor of more European solidarity because it would help them to have a fiscal counterparty at the central level of the union. Now, of course, the question is, if we do a fiscal union in Europe, how would that work, and would that be in favor of employers or employees? Sorry. So I'm not saying I don't take it for granted that doing this would be good, but it could be done in a way that is favorable for progressive policies, and the ECB would be actually in favor of this. And so it's just to say I believe the technocracy in Frankfurt at the ECB. I think there's a lot that we can gain by working with them. I'm not trusting national central banks and their governors because it's a lot more political. We've seen that. We've been championing the fight for greening the ECB policy, and what we've seen is the ECB leadership being super in favor of climate change, and the national central banks not really pushing at all. In fact, there's a whole bunch of central banks who are dead against. So, and that's really the issue. But then in terms of getting politics involved, to how much we want politicians to interfere with them, I think things are very subtle here, and I don't think we should have a black and white thing where it's like, okay, if you get a bit of parliament involvement, that means the end of independence. I think there are really 50 shades of ways to improve cooperation between politicians. I mean, cooperation or coordination, let's say, between governmental bodies at large and central banks. And right now we have this black and white debate where so I think there are ways we can improve, but it would take a lot. It would take another panel to explain in more details this.
Okay, I take this as a promise that we are going to organize another debate at some point at the ETUI from autumn onwards. And I hope at this time we could get an ECB representative also to have a counter argument to the very interesting ones that you made here today. So I would like to thank everyone for attending this early morning meeting on a subject that can be quite terse in general, but in these early hours even more. So thanks to the two speakers who made it here today. We now have about 20 minutes left for coffee break, and please join us again at 11 o'clock for a briefing meeting with Jackie Davis on what has been stated, what has been argued in the other research panels that we're running concurrently in other rooms. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.